other artifacts that will disappear in much more volume in the near future. All right, good evening. Good evening. All right. I'd like to start off with thanking the Save the Elms movement founder, Christy Rust, for mobilizing and engaging the wider public. The 3,000 members on the Facebook page, the many thousands who have signed the petitions, and the positive support from the countless stakeholders from across Canada. I'd also like to acknowledge Senator Lovelace Nicholas for discussing this important issue in the Senate and the support from the wider Holistic Way community as we sit here in their unceded traditional territory on the banks of the bountiful and beautiful river. To start, a brief review of Officer Square for context. The British first had a garrison here in 1784, which grew to over 50 buildings, of which only 4 remain. Officer Square is also significant to the formational years of Canada's senior regular force infantry unit, the Royal Canadian Regiment, a unit that I once served with. The RCRs first formed up in Officer Square on December 21st, 1883, as the Infantry School Corps. The Royal Canadian Regiment has been awarded 58 battle honors from the Northwest Rebellion in 1885 to Afghanistan, and has His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh as our Colonel-in-Chief. And it's not to mention the famous march, Winter March of the 104th Regiment, which of course started from Officer Square and now One Armed Yard perpetuates. So prior to the formal occupation by the British in Officer Square, we know that Loyalists set along the portion of the river. Early historic accounts mention the arrival of those loyal to the British Empire in the late fall of 1783, living mostly in tents and struggled to survive that first winter. Shortly thereafter, Fredericton became the capital city in 1785. As we continue our brief foray into the past, the French first built a fort at the mouth of the Nashwauk River in 1692, and a generation later, almost 100 Acadians had settled along St. Anne's Point by 1732. And while it may sound like the area at Officer Square has had a busy historical past, I've only just discussed the past 326 years. The European occupation of what is now Officer Square has been inhabited by the ancestors of today's Holistic Way for over 8,000 years. So for about 25 times longer than Europeans have been in the provincial capital, our Indigenous neighbors have hunted, fished, gathered plants for food, clothing, tools, housing, transportation, medicine and ceremonial purposes. They gathered for community events, not unlike the recent powwow at St. Mary's First Nation. They were born on, lived upon, and they were buried in this place. The items left behind by the ancestors of the Holistic Way tells us the story of how they lived and what they did, not only to survive, but thrive in New Brunswick for the past 13,000 years, long before the arrival of Europeans and the creation of the capital city. Although the city has professed how much it values the history and archaeology, not everyone is as well versed on the topic. So the most basic of terms, archaeology is the study of our past through material remains. These remains are in the forms of artifacts like the ones I've handed out, and features, things like fire pits, house foundations, living floors, post holes, artifact caches, and burials. While the written record can offer specific detailed accounts of the activities of the day, most historians will acknowledge that bias and inaccuracies are a part of that record, and will only ever present a minuscule amount of the activities of the people on the ground. Now this is where archaeology steps in to create a much more detailed account of the activities of the past. And keep in mind that the written record exists in Fredericton for only 2.5% of the time that people have been living here. The other 97.5% of human history in Fredericton is really only discernible through the archaeological record. And when the city gives permission to develop certain areas within its jurisdiction, without archaeological excavation, it is destroying that story. Now with that primer out of the way, let's talk a bit more specifically about the relevant jurisdictions and how they view our buried heritage. At the federal level, Parks Canada states, in principle, archaeological sites should be preserved in situ, meaning in place, by limiting negative impacts on the site's physical integrity. However, in situations where preservation is threatened, a controlled archaeological investigation should be undertaken using the highest recording standards to document the site's physical features. And without question, this is the case at Officer Square. At the provincial level, the professional minimum standards on assessing sites of unknown archaeological potential clearly state that any project that will impact the landscape that is within 100 meters of a known historic archaeological site, within 80 meters of the banks or shores of a current or former body of water, extends onto an active or former floodplain, or extends onto a flat, terrace, or intervale located within 100 meters of a river, is required to have archaeological excavation to determine if a site or sites are present. This has not happened. It is also important to point out another directive from the province as it relates to the ongoing development at Officer Square. They say, archaeological monitoring will not be conducted on areas under development which have not been assessed beforehand through some level of manual testing. This also has not occurred, and as a consequence, the city is responsible for the loss and destruction of history dating as far back as 8,000 years and significant to all Canadians. Now, speaking more specifically about the heritage resources at Officer Square, again, Parks Canada has stated as a character-defining element the integrity of any unidentified archaeological remains which may be found within the site in their original placement and extent. Now, the only way to identify these archaeological remains is through detailed archaeological excavation, not by hauling our history away in the back of a dump truck. At the provincial level, they list discovered and yet to be discovered archaeological resources associated with the past use of the site as a military compound, as their character-defining element. And as a character-defining element, as discussed by Chris, the provincial legislation in the Heritage Conservation Act requires it to be conserved. Conservation of archaeological resources can only be done through detailed manual excavation, never with a 51-ton machine that loads it into a dump truck for use as landfill. And finally, the current municipal plan states that Council values the spectrum of heritage resources, including archaeological and historical sites, and will seek and encourage the conservation of heritage resources in a manner that respects their value to the community, ensures their long-term integrity, and enables their functional viability in the future. Sadly, none of this is evident in Fredericton. What if the politicians of modern-day Pompeii decide to bulldoze that ancient site for a new football pitch? Or if Wiltshire County Council decided to break up those famous standing stones at Stonehenge for road fill? The decisions that City Council are making about our provincial heritage place will be your legacy. On which side of history will you be remembered? I'd like to invoke a famous slogan by the well-known suffragette from Moss Side, Manchester, Emmeline Pankhurst, and turn it on its head, so to speak. The city has made many declarations about how much it values its past. At our National Historic Site and Provincial Heritage Place, like Ms. Pankhurst, I demand deeds, not words. While it's true that Minister John Ames is responsible for the comprehensive cultural resource management of the province's archaeological heritage, as the developer, the City of Fredericton Mayor and Council have responsibility to its residents, to the citizens of New Brunswick, and all proud and patriotic Canadians to conserve our nationally significant heritage. Mayor and Council must respect our past, must respect the rule of law, and must conserve our non-renewable and exceptionally valuable cultural resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. This is Chris listeners. I'm probably going to mispronounce your name. Hopefully I'll get it right.